Welcome to a Conversation with Seraphina. That's me. And Rosemary Gladstar. It's so great to have you, Rosemary. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I live in Coast Salish territory in the Western Canada on a little island called Salt Spring Island. And I am a homeopath and herbalist of 20 years. I've been in clinical practice and I've been working with plants really since my childhood, since I was a very small child. So it's a real honor to have Rosemary Gladstar here today. I've been reading your books, Rosemary, since I think you first started publishing them. So it's so great to have you. And for those of you who don't yet know Rosemary, Rosemary Gladstar is a herbalist who has been living with herbs, teaching, writing about herbs, for 50 years. And she's been coined the godmother of American herbalism because this incredible woman has been sharing her passion throughout her entire life. I'd say revolutionizing and reinvigorating the herbal landscape for as long as you've been teaching, Rosemary. So thank you for your contributions. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge your contributions have been so heart-centered. And I think that's why so many people are still reading your books, and I'm recommending them. Every graduate class I have, I'm recommending your books. So, and I think it's because it's not just about information. Herbs are about the spirit and the heart, and they're much more than their constituents. And I think that's something that you and I share, is that understanding of plants being more than their constituents, that they're living beings who have so much to share with us. So thank you. And it's good to have you.
Thank you, Seraphina. It's great to be here, actually, with my cup of tea.
Yeah. What's in your cup of tea today?
Yeah, I've been enjoying just drinking really relaxed, especially when I'm busy. I really like drinking really relaxing things because I find I get more done because they help me center. So this tea is actually an old blend called, I used to call it Easy Now Nervine. It's called Cup of Calm now. And it has passion flower in it. And it has chamomile and lavender and a little catnip. And it has several mints to sort of give it a nice flavor, you know, kind of pick up those flavors a little, not enough that it overpowers it. And then just a tiny touch of stevia. So just to bring a little sweetness. Yeah, it's really nice. You know, I like the taste. I like with the lavender, because lavender is very powerful and somewhat pungent, aromatic, bitter herb. But I love the flavor. It's so long as it's not overpowering. And it's just perfect, actually, in this cup of tea.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm drinking I'm the same. When I'm busy and overwhelmed, I do not take adaptogens and all these stimulating herbs, and I don't drink coffee. And right now I'm drinking spearmint and peppermint, because I find them so uplifting and clarifying. And then I have a little bit of hibiscus in here to give it that sour richness. And I love the color. I think herbal teas and herbal blends should be beautiful, not just taste good and be effective. And then I also love elderberry. I have this thing where I like to have at least 3 different colors if I can. So the greens, the reds, and the purples are in my cup of tea today.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah.
You know, talking about colors and teas, I'm a late bloomer in discovering the butterfly pea flower. And when I did, somebody gave me a little bag, right? And it was in my closet. And so one day I just put it into my tea, not even knowing anything about it. And I was just stunned to see my tea turn this absolutely gorgeous indigo blue. It's stunning. It's just, and it's also has a lot of medicinal values and properties to it. As I of course studied it. I was so enthralled by it. So I do add it a lot now to tea, especially teas for children. And then what's really fun about it, so you get this beautiful blue, but if you add lemongrass to it, the blue before your eye transforms to green. And if you add lemon, it turns to a bright fuchsia color. Have you had?
Wow.
It's
No, that's great.
yeah.
Okay, that's going on my list. It's interesting you mentioned that. I just discovered a butterfly pea as well, but the powder, I got some at my local health food store, and I added just a little bit to my face creams.
Yeah.
And they turned the most incredible color, and I gave them out as holiday gifts. And it's beautiful. But what I learned as well, just because I'm not familiar with this plant, it has some emollient anti-inflammatory qualities to it. So it's great for the skin, not just beautiful. So that's great.
Yeah. It's beautiful. I did that this year when I made my cream. I used powdered rose petals from Anima Monday. They have this beautiful fuchsia colored rose. And so I went ahead and I put the powder in the cream, right? I've never done that before, but I'm watching it very carefully. When I sent it to my friends as a present, because it was stunningly beautiful. And then I added, I made it just a light pink so that it's just like a very beautiful pink kind of rose color. And then I added the rose essential oil, but I haven't used that powder in there before. And I have noticed, so a lot of times I've always told people, when you add things that might rot on your shelf, if I mix water with that rose powder and then I left it sit on my shelf, it will rot. And so sure enough, I'm getting a little bit of mold growth. So what I'm gonna do the next time is I'm gonna infuse those roses in the oil, and
Yeah.
then it will be foolproof. So yeah,
Yeah.
you just learn, we're still experimenting and still learning. That's
so
one of
fun
the
to,
things. Yeah, I mean, there's so much I love about herbalism, but one of the things is even after half a lifetime, or maybe more than half a lifetime, there's still so much to discover. I still feel like this child, like, oh my God, look, it turned the tea blue, or look at rose petals in the cream. It's so fun.
yeah, it is so fun. I feel the same.
Yeah.
On my off time, there I was mixing creams and creating all different kinds of
Yeah.
concoctions. And that's what I like to do on my off time, as well as this being my profession. So it's really fun.
Yeah. I don't know any herbalists, none in the hundreds that I know, that separate their work life from their real life. It's one and the same. You're an herbalist, and you're an herbalist at home, and you're an herbalist when you're out walking, and you're an herbalist when you're doing your work, right? It's really a life. It's a way of life.
It is. And I think it's also a calling, right? I think it's a vocation. It's a calling. So it's more than a career. And that I'd like to ask you, actually, if you're willing to share how you started on the herbal path. And just before you answer, I want to let everyone know who's listening and tuning in. We did close the chat for this time because we are such a large group, but we will open the chat at the very end. So thank you for your patience. And in the chat, you'll see a link to my natural family care kit, Rosemary's Cup of Calm class that's coming up January 19th. Really excited about that. I'm going to be there 6:30 p.m. Eastern. And then in the link in the chat, you'll also see Rosemary's Science and Art of Herbalism course that's on sale right now. And it's an incredible course, very affordable, and one of the most comprehensive courses out there. So please check out those links in the chat. So Rosemary, how did you get started on this path? And then we're going to jump into talking about some of our favorite herbs.
Yeah, I always say that I think I was born one of the lucky ones. So I grew up on a dairy farm in Northern California, and both of my grandparents lived close to us, and we had wonderful relationships with both. One of my grandmothers she and my grandfather were from Armenia. They were actually Armenian survivors of the Armenian genocide. They came to America right after the war, and my grandmother was very well trained in herbalism, very much like a lot of our grandmothers or younger people's great grandmothers might have been. They just used herbs as a way of life, and she was very interested in healing as well. And in fact, when she was in Armenia as a young woman, she was planning to go into nursing to further her education and healing. That never happened. So when we were growing up, it was very natural for my grandmother to take all of us. So it wasn't like I was signaled out as special or anything. She would just take us out when it's time to weed the garden or go on walks, and she would show us all these plants. Armenia is a Mediterranean country, so we were growing up in an area where the plants were very, very similar. And we also, growing up on a dairy farm in the 1950s and 1960s, my parents were very poor. And so I had the good fortune of never going to doctors, right? They really literally took care of everything. The only time in our entire childhood, the family of 5 children, that we went to the doctor was once when my sister fell off her horse and broke her hip. And the other was when my baby sister swallowed rat poison. I'm only laughing because she survived, right? And both of those situations were clearly allopathic situations for modern medicine. Mm-hmm. So, but my parents were able to raise 5 children, really basically taking care of everything with home remedies. And so both with my grandmother's influence and my parents' influence, we just grew up pretty much thinking that was how the world did it. But something did happen to me when I was younger, like when I was around in the 7th and 8th grade, I already knew that I had that calling with plants because I was so interested in studying wild plant identification and native uses of California plants. And my early studies at high school and elementary school were on that. I still have the books I did from the 7th and 8th grade. And so it just was kind of always a natural thing. It wasn't like I called myself an herbalist when I was in high school for certain. I don't even think herbalism was a profession at that time, quite honestly, but it was just a natural flow for me. And then in 1972, when I was in my early 20s, I think I was 21 or 22 at that time, I opened my first herb store. And that was sort of the beginning of working with the community and learning and just devoting my life to this work, really.
Yeah, that's such a great story. So powerful. It's interesting. I didn't know all of those details. And what we share is my maternal grandparents immigrated from Europe. And I remember as a little girl, my grandfather telling me that the village that they grew up in, they didn't have a doctor. You went to the village midwife. And really, you just everyone knew herbal medicine. Their parents knew herbal medicine. And they knew the recipes for how to prepare cough syrup and how to take care of so many common health issues or ailments. And I too grew up, thankfully, my mother was into natural medicine, and we saw a doctor, I don't know how many times, very few, similar to you. And I'm in my 40s now. I haven't ever taken an antibiotic. And I always like to say to my students, it's not because I don't believe in them, they can save lives.
Yeah.
But I'm grateful that, similar to you, I have a background in that I haven't needed them. And one of the beauties of herbal medicine, what I love about herbal medicine, is when you know enough information, you can stop certain ailments in their tracks, right? And you can, what I've seen clinically and in my personal life, you can arrest a situation from it moving on to a secondary infection, stop the severity of a issue, cold, flu, fever, virus, whatever it might be. And that's the beauty and the elegance of herbal medicine. It's more than just preventative medicine. It's so much more than that. What it's doing, in my opinion, is I feel like it improves the quality of how our body can function. It improves our overall wellness and vitality. And on an energetic level, I think it's improving our chi, the quality of our chi. So we're able to fend off infection more readily. We're able to bounce back more readily. And I just had a colleague actually say to me, she was drinking my cold and cough formula, which is very basic tea ingredients. We all know the mints, elderberry, mullein, campaign, licorice, rose hips, red clover. And she said, Seraphina, I don't know what it is about this tea. I drink it every day just because I'm drawn to it. And this is the first year working with the public, having a little toddler at home who's getting colds all the time from their school mates. And I haven't gotten sick once this year. How is that possible? And I said, of course, I'm not surprised at all, because the herbs are protecting you. It's not just a cold and cough tea. We're not using herbs like we use drugs. It's a completely different framework. Herbs are overall improving our wellness. And I think they nudge us into self-correction.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think all of that's so true and so well said. And I think it just boils down simply that we've evolved in relationship with plants from the very beginning of time. So even though our minds may not always recognize them, or sometimes not even feel safe with them for some people, our bodies and our cellular knowledge totally recognizes them and gets delighted when we use them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And our lives depend on them, right? Our breath is given to us by the green world, literally. They house us, they clothe us, they are part of our transportation. And yeah, there's such a deep intrinsic relationship, and they are our ancestors as well, the plants. So I'd love to talk about, before we got on screen today, we've been chatting back and forth just about some of our favorite plants. And I wanted to start with comfrey. That's a plant that we both love. And I love listening to you in particular talk about this plant, which has gotten some bad media, I think, and some misunderstanding. Comfrey, some phytum officinalis is one of my favorites. And I'll just briefly share that when I first met this plant, I made a fresh infusion with the leaves. And I do that every spring when it comes up fresh here. And what I love about it is, to my surprise, the infusion, the fresh infusion, is so gentle. And I think it tastes almost like cucumbers. And when I drink it, I usually drink it for about a month, just when it's coming up in springtime. I notice my skin and my hair improves dramatically. And any aches or pains that I might have are just gone. I've not needed it for any first aid situation myself, but I've certainly used it with many patients and friends and clients, which I'll share after. But I wanted to just pick off with Comfrey.
That's great. Are you not going to mention that it's illegal?
Oh, is it in America? Is it
It
illegal?
is in most countries, actually. It's actually illegal to use internally because of the possibility of paralyzing alkaloids. So I think that's important as part of the story is that in the 1980s, there was a famine in Afghanistan, and a small tribe of people having nothing to eat were gathering wild plants. And one of those plants was not comfrey, but was a member of the very large family that Comfrey is a part of. And many members in that tribe died. I forget the exact number, but it was quite shocking, actually, the number of people. They died from a disease called vena-occlusive liver disorder, which is caused by the alkaloids, paralyzing alkaloids. So the scientists very responsibly, and the researchers who were involved in this, they did do research on other members of the family, and they did find in some kinds of comfrey, like the Russian comfrey especially, there would be very small amounts of PAs. They did a worldwide search to see if there were any other cases of people that might have died. And they did find a couple of instances of people who had illnesses, who'd been in the hospital and were using comfrey as part of a protocol, but they were on lots of other things. So there was, in the studies that I read, there were 2 other people that were found.
Mm-hmm.
And then at that time, there was a lot of concern about using comfrey. And many countries did make it illegal. In the United States, it's illegal to take internally. There's no question about the safety externally. There is a lot of questions about about using it internally, but like Seraphina, I've been a longtime advocate of comfrey. I honestly can't say that I have the right answer. I don't even know that I'm right or wrong. I don't really think it's about that so much. I think what I always say to people, if they question it, is just to do the research, because when I did the research and looked at the studies, I was even more convinced that comfrey really wasn't a problem. But I still would question it because so many of my friends were not using it anymore. But when I would sit with comfrey, which ultimately to me is that incredible, deep personal relationship that you can have one-on-one with plants, I would always get that it didn't mind if people thought it was unsafe. It was just going to go on growing, and that eventually people would realize it was good for them. So I've been an advocate for comfrey long before this discussion even came up. It was in the 1970s and the early 1980s, when I started my herb business, comfrey was probably as popular as echinacea and elderberry is now. So echinacea and elderberry weren't hardly even talked about it in the 1970s and the early 1980s. But comfrey was the herb of choice, and it was used for all kinds of things. It's very high in allantoin. It really is very, and mucilaginous material. So it's very excellent for irritated lungs. It's one of the best herbs for repairing broken bones and ligaments. It has an incredibly long history for joints and achy muscles, like you were saying, achy joints. Mm-hmm. It's just used so much. And even in the area that I grew up in, Northern California, the local farmers were growing it in the fields in acreage and would feed it to their cattle because it enriched the milk. So it was just a very, very popular plant. But what really made me an advocate for it is, like, when I was in my early 20s, I was doing an herb walk and I actually got run over by a Harley Davidson. It's only funny because I didn't die, but it did injure me pretty badly. I ended up in the hospital for a long time, and I had 2 severely injured legs. One was I had compound fractures, so that was part of the problem. one of my legs was damaged so badly that the doctors told me from the very beginning it wasn't going to heal. But I was so convinced. I was like, really young, and I just believed that the herbs could do anything. And I just kept telling that doctor that no way, because he said to me, quote, "Nothing you take into your body is going to make any difference for that leg." And I'm looking at him like, "You're crazy." And anyway, so I really literally turned green at the gills. I ate and drank so much comfrey. I juiced it, I steamed it, I ate it every way you could possibly think. It took 18 and a half months, so almost 2 years, but I got full use of my leg back. I have very, very little problem. I have a little problem with my ankle because I had a full leg in those days. We're talking about, it was the very, either late 1970s or very early 80s. They were still using full plaster casts, right? So my ankle was in a plaster cast, immovable, for almost 2 years. So I have a little bit of stiffness in my ankle, but other than that, it was totally fine. So when the question came up about comfrey, I felt like it had stood by me and, really, really stepped up for me, and that I needed to do the same for it. So I've continued to use comfrey, but even when I teach about it, I always do mention, that it's important that everybody do their own research and have their own conversations and make their own decisions. And for beginners, that can be hard to do. When you're first learning the language of a new country, of a new species, of a new being, it's not always easy to hear what, to receive those messages or to understand what's being said to you. So it's important that, especially if you're beginning, that you feel safe. So I would just say, create a safety net around you and maybe do your research and just study about comfrey and get a really sense for how you feel about it. So that's kind of, I love the plant, it's big and hardy. Once you plant it in your garden, it's never going to go away. It's a perfect gift to take to anybody, right, who has a beautiful garden, and you say, plant this at the edge of your garden. It will be a constant friend. Everything about it is just it's a wild, wonderful, incredible being.
It is, and it's such important bee food. That's one of my great joys. It has a
Yeah.
long flowering period, at least in the climate where I live. And
Yeah.
one of my great joys is just watching the bees feast on it. They get drunk and they buzz in the evening, when just before the sun is setting. The bees are still feasting on the comfrey.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm a huge fan. One of my most remarkable stories early on in my career, I guess I was in my early to mid 20s. And this man had, he was working in construction. He had a terrible fall.
Mm.
And I live here rurally. And he just said, I don't have a lot of money to spend on, he abstained from alcohol. He said, I can't take alcohol tinctures. I don't have a lot of money for pills and supplements. Is there something I can just eat or drink in my garden that's more up my alley? And I thought, well, comfrey. And it was around that time where there was grumblings about the safety of comfrey. But I learned I was confident in my use of it. And I said, why don't you make an infusion of this tea? And I taught him how to do that with the fresh plant. And within a couple of days, he called me and he said, is it possible that this one plant
Yeah.
has taken the pain out of my rib cage? Because he had a terrible fall and his ribs
Yeah.
were just completely busted and there's nothing that they could do. He said, is it possible? And I said, I think it is possible.
It is
And
definitely possible.
I was blown away. He was blown away, but it was my first time really seeing it in action, similar to your story, where it alleviated his pain within a couple of days.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean he was back to work. It doesn't mean that he didn't need more time off, but he was progressively getting better and better and better. And that, I just felt that was such a great gift to give somebody who had a history of addiction, who couldn't consume alcohol, who was very cautious around pain medication because of his history. And here we had something that was virtually free, that grows in our farmer fields as well, that could not only alleviate his pain, but comfrey's full of beautiful minerals and vitamins. It's nourishing. It's like a food. It has a high nutritional profile.
Yeah.
So that's, again, why I love herbs so much. They're not like drugs. They're not just taking away our pain. They are increasing and adding to our wellness. And I often say to my students, the side effect, you'll have some more nutrients. You'll probably sleep better because your inflammation is going to be lower. I mean, the side effects are usually desirable and beautiful. So comfrey's a good friend of mine as well.
Yeah.
And what about, I want to talk about St. John's wort and nettle. Where would you like to go first, St. John's or nettle?
Well, maybe we'll do nettle first because it probably is one of my top 30, 50 herbs. But people always say, like, if you had to choose one herb, but it's like trying to choose your favorite child. It's impossible, but nettle's been an ally for mine. It's been so exciting to see this kind of, cranky, fussy herb become so popular. I know when I was growing up, I mean, everybody hated it, like in the farm community, because it grew and, out in the cattle fields. And then if you're out walking, you get stung. That's what's my early knowledge of it. It wasn't a plant my grandmother used, but I used to be riding my horse and fall off in a pile of nettle, and I'd have it welts you. You get bad welts from it, right? And it's true. We can say that, yes, herbalists used to use that and still do for urtication. They'd use the much like people use bee stings, only it's much more humane to use the nettle for the histamine reaction that it gives. It has that formic acid in the little needles, little needle-like protrusions. But I just have always, as I grew older and started working with plants, I came to have a really deep respect. And I think the story that really pops out for me was, and I think maybe this might be one of the reasons I love nettle so much, because it taught me really about plant communication, and it really taught me about that lost language of plants. So I don't ever say that it's a forgotten. I just think that or I wouldn't say it's lost. I would just say it's forgotten. It's like we have to learn that language again. But I actually was traveling to Canada. I was Norma Myers was a friend of mine, also one of my teachers, and she lived on this little island called Alert Bay on the northernmost tip of Vancouver
Vancouver
Island. So
Island,
it's way
yeah.
up there. And you had to travel a long ways, and it took a lot of time. But a lot of young people I know at that time, again, this was in the 1970s, would travel up there to study with her, because we didn't have many opportunities. There weren't many teachers. And my generation really thrived and leaned towards the elders, because they were like repositories of knowledge that was being lost. So Norma she would open her home to people, right? And she was married to a native fisherman. They lived in a really tiny, modest little home in the village. But she would always have these young sleeping hippies on her floor, right? We would just be sleeping there, and she would do her classes right in her living room with us. I remember in the morning, I would hear her husband get up and kind of step over bodies as he'd be going out to get on his fishing boat and go fishing. So I had traveled for almost 2 days to get there, and arrived by the time I took the last ferry that would take you from the island to the other little island. It was evening, and I was very hungry when I got there. But I certainly wasn't going to ask my hostess for food. And I had noticed when I walked into the house this enormous patch of nettle, of course, growing in her backyard. So I just thought I'd go out and pick some nettle and steam it for dinner, because it's a delicious green, right? It's one of the best tasting greens there is. Once you steam it, you tame it, you get the sting out of it. So she had the gathering basket and the gloves on the porch, like any good herbalist would, and a pair of scissors. I gathered up my tools to go out and harvest. I'm out there. I've traveled all day. I'm with one of my favorite teachers in the world, and the sun is going down, and I'm in heaven, really. I just feel so alive with life, and I'm clipping my dinner, and really, literally, it was only a few times in my life I've heard the plants speak in English. It's usually a deeper kind of communication, but those nettles clearly yelled at me, "Take your gloves off." And I'm like looking at the plants. I felt like just this little kid looking at the plants going, "No way, I know how you sting." But I got that message again. And, I think this might be one of those places where I am wise, is I listen when those plants speak to me, and I trust them, just like with the comfrey. And so I did. I took my gloves off, and I just continued to pick, and my hands started burning like they were on fire. And then I learned the secret, right? That I've always read about, but didn't really trust, that the best antidote for nettle rash is nettle juice. The longer I picked, it wasn't that I didn't feel them. My hands went from hurting to just being like, I would say, like healer's hands. They were lit up with energy. And that feeling lasted with me for many days, but Yeah, it was an amazing, amazing experience for me. It really totally changed my relationship with plants. That evening in the back of Norma Meyer's yard with the nettle talking to me, it was like, oh, this is what is possible.
Yeah.
This is what is possible. So, and that's what I've cultivated my whole life, is that kind of relationship, you know, to go out like a child and pick those nettles with my bare hands or whatever it is, and just allow that experience to infuse me. Yeah.
That's such a beautiful story, Rosemary. I thank you for sharing that. I love it. And just being so close to the region where you studied with Norma is so
Yeah.
special to hear that. And a little side note is 25 years ago, one of her last remaining students gifted me her notes,
Oh
many
my
of her
goodness.
notes as a gift.
That's a
Um,
treasure.
it is a treasure, yeah. And when I next see you, maybe even next week when I see you, I'll bring some of those so you can see them
Yeah.
typed on her typewriter,
Yeah.
and many of them written by hand. So what a beautiful link.
Yeah. It is a beautiful link. Yes.
My
Yeah.
Nettle story, again, around 25 years ago, I was still in school and I had this woman come to me. I was working in a health food store at that time, and she had was born with one kidney and one adrenal gland, and stress impacted her greatly, and she was going through a terrible divorce. My students know this story, but I didn't know what to give her. I was still learning. I didn't know what to do with someone whose anatomy was like that. I wanted to be very precautious. And I heard a voice, just give her nettle infusion and dried Avena sativa oat straw. At the time it was oat straw. Milky oat tops wasn't quite as popular
Yeah.
or used as it is now. And I gave her those two things to drink as an infusion. And she was, for the reasons being, she was stressed, she was losing hair, she wasn't sleeping well. Her whole endocrine system was upside down. She was going through perimenopause. And once again, I just said, okay, drink a liter of this a day and call me in a week. I don't know what's going to happen. And once again, it was one of those stories that has always stuck with me, because she said, I can't believe it, but I'm sleeping better. So much has improved so quickly. And she ended up staying on those two herbs as an infusion for, I think, 3 or 6 months.
Oh, yeah.
And she said it was like unwinding 10 years of stress. And she was really drawn to the nettle, the dried nettle. And she would say to me, when I drink the nettle, I feel like I'm getting this, I'm getting an IV full of nutrients. I'm craving it. I crave it so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
So that's remained to be an ally. I worked with her for a good 10 years and she always went back to nettle. My other nettle story is in 2013, I was in Ecuador, high up in the mountains in the Andes. And this indigenous woman, Andean woman, offered me a cleansing. And we didn't speak the same language, but I got what she was inferring to. And she asked me to remove all my clothes. And then, to my shock, she started to whip me head to
With the
toe.
nettle.
She was whipping me head to toe with nettle. And I
Yeah.
think there was a little bit of mint in there because I could smell it, but I knew what nettle looked like. And when she was approaching me with this long wand of nettle and mint, I started to freak out and shake, because my grandfather told me stories when he was a child. Kids would play with each other by throwing one of them in a nettles patch. So that always stuck in my mind. I had not yet experienced the nettles welts. And so there I was, shaking naked as this woman begins to whip me with nettle head to toe. And I felt the heat and the histamine reaction coming on. And I got really nervous.
Yeah.
But then her bundle began to juice, naturally expressed juice from the whipping.
Yes. Yes.
And I felt the relief at the same time.
Yeah.
And for about I would say 3 or 4 days, I felt a bit of the sting in the heat, but I remember as soon as I left her, I felt invigorated, like I'd never felt before. I felt alive, awake, blood was pumping. I did feel the
Yes.
rash, but for days I felt invigorated, alive, refreshed. It was an incredible experience, and my fear of nettle was completely removed that day.
Yeah. You know what David Hoffman always says? I love this quote. I think it's like, it could be a bumper sticker. When in doubt, use nettle. And that was after actually a long class on chemical constituents and counter indications of plants. You know, he'd done this really very erudite, wonderful lecture at the International Herb Symposium. And at the very end, he leans up into the podium and goes, when in doubt, use nettle. I think he's quoted very often, but I think that is his most famous quote for certain. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, right? I mean, it's one of the best alternatives. In herbalism, we call it an alternative. So it has a function and an ability to, I would say, improve all the detoxification pathways, all the important pathways of the body. It's so good for stress and the endocrine system, the hormonal system, blood loss, all the rest of it. I mean, it's so nourishing. Though my favorite is food. We live in a place where we get nettles twice in the spring, and then it has another growth where I live in late August. Is that where you are too? Do you see that?
Yeah, if you cut it, if we cut it back, we get you know, several harvests because our summers are so cool. But yeah, I mean, if you just let it grow, then it will seed, and it's not, you know, not so good to harvest when it's at seed, except for the seeds, right? But generally, if we cut our patches back, then we do get more nettles, and we can get 2 or 3 harvests in a spring, and the same in the fall again. But it's really about cutting it back, you know, allowing it to continue to grow. And I agree, it's just one of the most delicious greens. I have this very famous recipe that I've been making, you know, for the last 40 years. So it's like a Greek spinach pie, like a spanakopita, only we make it with nettle. And, you know, it's always the featured dish at like, you know, at herbal classes and stuff, because it's so delicious. It's a wonderful way to introduce people to eating wild greens, because it's rich and it's full of feta and, you know, eggs and cheese and all that. But yeah, the nettle in there is just, you can use it for anything. Any place you'd use a regular green, you'd use nettle, but you always have to make sure it's very well steamed, you know, because if you, like a lot of times I like to put a lot of greens in a pot, you know, and steam them lightly. But if I do that with nettle and I have some that aren't quite steamed well in the middle, then you can get a really pretty bad bite in your mouth, a little welt. So steam them well. That's really the most important thing.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah.
So we have time just for 1 or 2 more herbs. How about St. John's wort? And then I think we should also mention onion, and a part of me wants to also fit in melon, but let's see where we get. Let's see where we go.
Yeah, let's see. St. John's wort. Well, one of the wonderful things about St. John's wort, of course, is that it, you know, the practice that we do today with making the oil goes back thousands and thousands of years. And anybody who's from, especially European descent, Mediterranean, somewhere in their ancestry, they had ancestors, grandmothers or grandfathers, who would go out and collect the beautiful blossoms of the St. John's wort and make St. John's wort oil exactly in the same way that we do it today. So that recipe has been passed down and shared for generations. So that's one of the things that I always find so exciting when I go out, you know, even today when I go out to gather the St. John's wort flowers, you know, and I pluck the flowers. So that's one thing you always have to do, is you pluck them and you press them between your fingers. And I found that actually the buds, right before they're getting ready to open, not when they're in full bloom, but right when the buds are ready to open, is when those oil ducts are the richest. And one of the magics of it is that beautiful yellow flower that's like the reflection of the sun produces a red oil that's very high in hypericin. So it's like so fun and magical to take those yellow flowers and those buds, you've pressed them, you get like a blood red stain on your finger. And that's how you know that's perfect. And when your fingers are staining blood red, then you pick those little blossoms and you put them in olive oil or alcohol, and you get this absolutely deep blood red oil or tincture. So that's one of the things that I love impressing with my students, you know, that this is something that's been done for generations and generations through the centuries and shared freely. You know, I would say most herbal recipes and remedies have been shared freely between people and cultures. And, you know, it's kind of like, even today, you meet somebody from another country, you immediately want to share what you know, your recipes, and then you hope they take them and use them and add their own ingredients and make them theirs. That's really been part of the legacy of herbalism, is this incredible sharing that's been worldwide. But I think one of the things that really, so when I was studying herbs, that was one of the very first herbs I learned for certain. And my very first salve was a St. John's wort salve. It was actually an old formula. I think I got it out of Dr. Kloss or Dr. Shook. I can't remember. It's been so many years ago, but it's quite famous now. It's a St. John's wort calendula comfrey salve, kind of what we consider an all-purpose salve. So I had made my first salve, and for anybody listening, that feeling when you've made your first salve, because it's so simple and it turns out so perfect. I mean, I think that's why there were so many salve companies that started, because your first batch was like, oh my God, look, I made this perfect product. So that's how my first salve was. I was like, oh, look at this. It is like manna from heaven. It is so beautiful and just so perfectly solid, and it looks so beautiful in the jar. So I had just made my salve. It was sitting on the shelf with all the herbs I'd collected, and it was beautiful, kind of a golden, little bit of a reddish color in it from the St. John's wort. And I was steaming rice in the oven, and I had it in a cast iron skillet with a lid on. And for some bizarre, stupid reason, I reached in and I used my hand like a pot holder, and I grabbed a hold of that lid. And of course, I seared the palm of my hand right across this big red welt, and it hurt like crazy. So I immediately put it under cold water to kind of take the heat out. And then I saw my salve jar sitting there waiting for me, right? And I slathered it on. I put it on really thick, almost like a poultice. I put a big thick layer on it, and then I filled a bucket up with ice, put my hand in it with my hand covered with that salve, and fell asleep. That's a good thing to do when you have a lot of pain. I just went to sleep. And when I woke up a few hours later, it was actually literally like a miracle. I didn't even have a burn on my hand. I think it might have been a little tiny bit red, but nothing hurt. The boil that had already formed was gone. My hand looked beautiful. And then in all my young enthusiasm, which happens to, I think, every herbalist, it was like, oh my God, I made a miracle. And so I re-poured that salve into tons of little jars, and I took them down to all the local restaurants. And that was the first time I really explored having other people using these herbal remedies outside my friends and stuff. And then I'd stop in at the restaurants and ask how the salve was working, and everybody was like so excited, and they were telling me about all these miracles that happened from this burn salve. That's what I called it. And so I started my very first herb company based on that. It was called Country Comfort. It's still out there. Country Comfort makes baby products, and they still have that salve. And then the next company, of course, was Traditional Medicinals. But that was the first product in my first herb company, was that St. John's wort salve, or what we call burn salve. Really is an all-purpose salve. But yeah.
That's such a great story. That's such a great story. Yes, I know all about the excitement of those salves. I mean, it's so easy to make, and the ingredients are beautiful from the garden, or for people who don't have access to gardens, you can buy the oils nowadays. Nowadays, people are so lucky. There's so many products available. You could buy St. John's wort oil if you live in an urban setting and you don't have access to the plant itself.
But it grows in empty lot. I mean, it really, literally, if you live in a temperate region, you can find that plant anywhere. You can find it in empty lots in the city, on the edge of parks. It shows up. You start looking, and these plants appear for you.
Yeah, and the neat thing about medicinal herbs, is they're weeds. So they're often going to these places that are abandoned, like old parking lots or cities, the cracks between city sidewalks, to remediate the soil, to heal the land. They're not just here healing our bodies, right? That's a very human-centric way of looking at plants. They're here to remediate soil and heal torn tissue, the earth. They're here to provide food and medicine for animals, and food for bees and pollinators. So it's such a good point. These herbs are so-called weeds that they're healers themselves. So they're often in all those places. I love going to cities for that reason, and seeing what plants are showing up. And that tells me a story of what's going on in the soil there, or that part of the world, or that backyard burned part of, an old abandoned lot. So you, I'm sure, I know for a fact, because I've seen them, you've got beautiful salve recipes in your books. You've got beautiful salve recipes in your herbal course. I also have a salve that includes St. John's wort in my natural family care kit. So people, and it's easy to make, right, Rosemary? I would say that students, you don't need to be a herbalist. You don't have to have needed to complete any formal education to be able to make a salve. I think it's something that beginners can do in what, 10 minutes? Yeah, it's so fun.
Yeah.
One of my, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just thinking, like I have my own definition of a herbalist, and I always think that, if you love plants and work with them, so a lot of times people think herbalist means a medicinal, somebody who is trained in medicinal herbalism. But when you think about what medicine is, that term is very broad. So medicine can be just walking in the forest, right? Medicine can be gardening. So it's very hard to define what healing in medicine is, because it has so many different guises and so many different forms. So I always just feel like even beauticians, who work with natural products, they are like healers in a way, because people come into them and don't feel good about their hair or their skin, and they work their magic on them, right? And when you leave, you feel healed and whole oftentimes. So I feel like if a person really works with plants and loves them, that defines an herbalist to me. It's really more about intention. And you have beginner herbalists. Like if I'm just starting my work with plants, I would just say I'm a beginner herbalist. I sort of feel like I'm a beginner herbalist, right? And if you've worked with plants a really, really long time, then you could say you're more experienced herbalist. But there, for a long time, that word herbalism was being usurped by like a clinical herbalist or somebody who worked just medicinally. And I understand why, because we're trying to have a definition for what herbalism is. But it was when I try to define what healing is. It has so many levels. And as natural healers, we know that healing isn't always the outcome that people expect or that an allopathic doctor might expect. Healing can be manifest in an entirely different way. So I just love the term. If people love plants and they work with plants on whatever level, like they can be healing the earth with gardens, or a farmer who's doing organic methods and planting herbs for healing the earth. I would call that person an herbalist, an herbal
Absolutely.
farmer. I have my daughter and her husband are herbal farmers. They work to heal the earth through the medicinal plants they grow and then sell to other people. So I just wanted to clarify that, because, you might have some people listening who, and they might just be beginners and playing with the plants, and yeah, just own the title and start working, working with plants.
Absolutely. Herbalism is people's medicine, right? It's the original medicine, and the World Health Organization still to this day declares that plant medicine, various traditions unique to each region, plant medicine still is the number one method of healing in the world, because we've co-evolved with plants and we have an intrinsic relationship to them. And people throughout time have hid recipes in cooking. Food is nutrition. Food, I mean, it's just really a spectrum. Herbalism and nutritious cooking, food, right, is our first line of, I would say, healthcare. And so that margin is not as great as people might think. But I'm very passionate about encouraging people to pick up this lost, I love how you said not forgotten, but this lost way of working with plants, because it's intrinsic to being human. Yeah. So we're coming up close to the top of the hour. I do want to mention a few. Do you want to speak to one more plant, Rosemary? Is there any plant tugging at your psyche right now?
Well, they all are. I feel this whole chorus. But it's whatever you feel, honey. Wait, you want to talk about more plants?
I think what I want to open up the chat in just a moment, but before we do, I do want to again let people know that you can find more ways to learn and work with plants through both Rosemary and I. In the chat, we've got the Natural Family Care Kit, which is a digital kit that has recipes such as first aid salve and onion packs. And the Natural Care Kit basically covers 20 different conditions, and I provide you with recipes, home management care that's been evaluated by a physician, monographs on plants, supply kit to how to build your own first aid kit, lots of resources, dosing charts, conversion charts for dosing with children or the elderly. So there's lots and lots of material there. And you see that in the link. And then I do want to encourage you to join Rosemary on January 19th with the beautiful Helen Ward. They're going to be talking about a cup of calm. Can you say a few words about that class, Rosemary? The description sounds incredible. I'll be there for sure.
Thanks. Yeah, well, it's just because right now in the world, everything seems so heavy for people. There's just so much so much loss people have experienced, and then just with the war in Ukraine and the wars all around the world, and it's easy to get bogged down in despair, and then I always think about how the plants have just survived and lived through so much. I was talking to you about this earlier, but just like volcanic eruptions, etc. And we have this, and tectonic plates and ice ages, and yet they just continue to thrive, and not only thrive for themselves, but also give out. And so we have this incredible resource available to us, that helps lift our spirits up and makes us feel more centered and more calm. Just like we were talking about in the beginning, a lot of times when there's a lot of anxiety or stress, or we're really, really busy, people's tendency is to speed up and to take a lot of stimulants. Sometimes those are necessary, but really more often what's necessary is to come into center and to feel grounded, to put our roots down. And so this class is really about that. It's about building our nervous system by embracing plants that actually help us feel centered and calm, and just ways of self-nourishing. We'll talk about the ritual act of bathing and making anointing oils and herbal formulas that we can use that are actually really helpful for calming us and also lifting us, and helping to remind us really how much joy there is around us. In spite of everything, we have a lot in the world we have no control of, but we do have control of the things that we do. And those things we can easily shift and change. So that's what we're going to be just talking about. It's creating more joy in the midst of a chaotic world. Quite frankly, the world is always chaotic. There's times when it's more intense and times that it's less. And we just happen to be alive now, so it feels really intense for us. But when I look back in history, there's not a whole lot of times that realistically, I wouldn't want to be alive during World War II, or when all the colonists were coming in and suppressing all the native people and cutting all the forests. I really, as you look back, or in Europe when the Vikings were coming down, and people just have to get it together, and I think we are. As crazy as it seems, I think we are at a turning point, and I still have hope in people. And I think the earth is fighting back really royally. That's what we're seeing. She's striking back. If you're going to mess with the mother, you better wear protection. And she's coming at us, and people are beginning to pay attention. So I think it's hopeful. And I think I just choose to remain hopeful because it's so depressing not to be. I can be a lot more active if I'm hopeful.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. Plants have so much to offer us and to teach us, because I think they change our consciousness as well when we're working with them.
Yeah.
Robin, our moderator, I am just wanting to make sure that, can you make sure that everyone can see the chat? We will, for folks who are not able to see the chat, or you're on an iPhone listening to this and you can't see the chat box, I will be sending out an email. Please make sure to check out your email. I'm going to have the link to Rosemary's class, my family care kit. And then also the next thing I want to mention is Rosemary's Science and Art of Herbalism course, which is incredible. I highly recommend if you want a deeper dive and you want to learn how to not only learn about these plants, many plants that we just touched on a few, and learn how to make herbal medicine. I'd say that's Rosemary's specialty. You definitely want the Science and Art of Herbalism, which is on sale, very affordable course. And is it self-paced, Rosemary?
It's self-paced, yes, up for I think 3 years, and then people they can pay a little more and then get another extension. I used to have it go on forever, but then it didn't encourage people to finish. And plus it was meant that I just had this incredible ongoing student body. So about 10 years ago, we changed it. I've been offering this course since 1981. I've had some updates, of course, but for a long time. I think the most empowering thing about this course, the thing that is that you get lots of personal attention. We actually still review and grade homework. And it's about developing a personal relationship, like how to really meet the herbs and trust your experience with them. So we really try to emphasize that. like you do,
Yeah.
actually, just the same
Yeah.
as you do.
Yeah. We share some similar values around learning herbal medicine for sure. So there's just a couple questions before we're at the top of the hour already. Michaela asks, for those of us who don't have access to garden space, would it be possible to grow these herbs in pots on a patio? Resounding yes. That's the
Yeah,
beauty of
yeah.
herbs. They are tough, they are tenacious, they are resilient. Many of them don't need much water. You can neglect them. I don't encourage you to, but they're hardy. They're warriors of the earth. So absolutely that you can grow them in a patio in an apartment. Yes. Paige says she's taking your course. Excited about that.
Oh, thank you, Paige.
Yeah, Vivian says I've been thinking a lot about healing the soil, the skin of the earth. So I was especially excited to hear you both talk about it. Can you recommend what we can do intentionally to heal our soils? What a great question.
Yeah, well, Comfrey is definitely, both Comfrey and Nettle are soil, as Seraphina said, all of the weedy plants, or most of them, come in when there's disturbed soil, and they come in as warrior plants to restore vitality to the soil. So that's partly what they're doing, but there are ones that are really easy to grow and restore really quickly. So I would say definitely Comfrey. The one thing about planting Comfrey in your garden soil is once it's planted, it's almost impossible to eradicate, because with the roots, it has very large root systems. And as you try to dig those roots out, if you leave even a tiny little piece in, it will sprout up another plant. So that is the one thing. But a lot of people, what they do is they'll grow a patch of Comfrey, and then they'll make like a Comfrey mulch, and they use the Comfrey in their compost because it's so concentrated in nutrients. And then they add that to the soil. And Nettle is exactly the same. Like people who do permaculture and who are doing a soil remediation, they often will make composts, like a manure tea, a green tea it's called, of the Comfrey and the Nettle. And then they feed the soil with that. But so there's some really, really good methods, but I would say those two herbs in particular, and then the weedy species, just invite them to come in. And some of them really settle in and want to make their home there. Like for instance, if you invite mugwort into your garden, you will never get it out again. So you have to be a little thoughtful about that. What I would say is that you should have an edge of the garden, someplace away from your garden, that you invite some of those more vigorous weeds to grow. You want them, but you may not want them in where you're going to plant your vegetables and your flowers. So Seraphina,
Yeah, I think that's great. The other thing I'll add, and we have this in our harvesting ebook, if Robin, you want to drop the link to that, is I love making compost tea. So I'll grab leaves of comfrey and nettle and even dandelion or weeds that I'm taking out of the garden. I'll put them in a big trash can bucket, fill it with water, add a little titch of molasses, like a tablespoon of molasses, and then it begins to ferment. It'll smell like manure, which is what you want. And then I feed that to all my plants. And within 24 hours, they're all perking up and they're all pretty excited about that. And then I throw all that decomposed plant sludge back into the garden, and then I cover it with hay. So there's so much we can do.
Seaweed too, we should mention, because that's another thing. If you live anywhere near the coast where you can go down and get a nice bucket of seaweed, that's another incredibly replenishing, so full of trace minerals. And the salt is not a problem. It's really, really wonderful. That's actually from places like in Ireland and Welsh and Scotland that have so much seashore. That's the one way that they replenish their soils, with that seaweed.
There's another good question, Rosemary. What are your favorite herbs to travel with? We're both going to be traveling soon, so this will be good to hear.
If you're talking about traveling for like a first aid, is that what the question is? What I would have?
Yeah, they don't specify. Just generally, what are your favorite herbs to travel with?
Yeah, I mean, I always take my own teas with me, and usually I take them in tea bag just because it's easier. I always have them. So if I'm on a plane or anywhere I end up, I will have herb tea. But in my first aid kit, what I usually travel with actually is a little golden seal. I still use golden seal, even though I know it's highly endangered. I either used to grow it when I lived at Sage Mountain, where I could grow it, or I always buy from cultivated sources. So I feel really good about supporting what I consider another endangered species, and that's the farmer and those growers who are growing these plants. So But I just feel it works so well. And it's been an ally of mine ever since I started first working with plants. So, and I like to have it because it's great for any kind of infection. If I start to feel anything externally happening or internally, that golden seal just stops it in its tracks. And of course, I always travel with echinacea. I'm sort of an old school, I met these plants a long, long time ago, and they're like my buddies. So I continue to use them. But echinacea, I find to be so powerful. It really works for me if I feel anything coming on. I usually always travel with a little cayenne. You don't usually need to travel with cayenne because you can find it in most people's kitchens, etc. But I like to have it because it serves as a stimulant. It's very warming. I tend to get sluggish when I travel, so it gets everything moving. That serves as a nice mild laxative. And again, if I start to feel a cold or something coming on, I just mix it with a little echinacea and the golden seal. And so I have a really perfect little remedy. And I usually travel with lavender, usually in an essential oil. When I take these little kits with me, I want everything to be very versatile, right? So one thing does 10 things.
Yes.
So the lavender will put it in my bath water, and I have a relaxant. I put it in a little spritzer boy jar, and I can spray it on things that may not look so clean to me, or if there's a lot of colds or flus or pandemics going around, I can use it as a disinfectant. If I start to get a headache, I can rub it on the nape of my neck and on my forehead. If I'm stressed out, I can just smell it, so it just is so versatile. I like it for that reason. And then peppermint is the other. I travel with what I call the 3 essential oils. It's peppermint, lavender, and tea tree. Just basic remedies, and I put those in with the golden seal. The golden seal is in powder form, the cayenne's in powder form. The echinacea, I like a little bit in powder form, and also a little bit of tincture. So that's usually when I'm looking at what I'm taking along as my healers. And then what Seraphina said, like anywhere you go, anybody's kitchen, or if it's not, they don't have herbs in their kitchen, you just go to a supermarket. All of the culinaries are amazing medicinal. So there's been a lot of times I've ended up places where I've had my little kit, but there might be a raging flu or something. I just pull open the drawer, and if there's turmeric, rosemary, thyme, I have everything I need to make syrups and capsules. Yeah. It's just learning those really common remedies. And for those of people who are kind of just beginning this path, I would say it can seem overwhelming because there's so many of them. And even in this short conversation, Seraphina, I've talked about so many plants, but you could start with just, 8, 9, 10 at the max of common herbs, and you get to know those. It'd be like making a circle of friends, and you really want to get to know those friends. So you have 10's max, and you just spend some time knowing them, and you have them on hand so you can play with them in your food, in your medicines. And that's how you grow in your herbal knowledge. Just get to know a few and work with them and honor them, read about them. And then you'll begin to be, as Seraphina said in the beginning, you'll begin to be called into their world. And then they wrap their arms around you, and then just go with them, because they will take you to very fabulous places in yourself and in the world.
They will. They are each an entire pharmacy, one plant. You could spend your whole life studying one plant. I feel that way in some ways. I have my favorites. Elderberry is one of my favorites. I mean, I have many, many favorites. Like you said, it's hard to select one, but I find the relationship continues the more you work with them. We're just over time, so I'm going to wrap up, but I wanted to just say one last thing about travel. My travel kit is very similar to yours, but what I like to do with lavender essential oil is, especially if I'm going to be on a plane, is I'll wet a face cloth and I'll dab lots of lavender essential oil in it, put it in a little Ziploc bag when I'm on the plane, because I don't like the air. I'll just put it up to my face, and it hydrates. And then I also just like to take in the scent of lavender.
Yeah, I know, it's such a more thoughtful way. I used to have a little spritzer bottle. When I get on the plane, I would spritz my area, but my husband, Robert, who's much more sensible than I, and probably more sensitive to other people, would say, Rosemary, not everybody likes the smell of your lavender spritzer. And so I actually do that same thing. I'll put it on a little face cloth and just smell it, or on the tip of, when I was wearing my mask on the planes, when I was flying, I would definitely put lavender inside, because it was such a wonderful disinfectant, and also very calming and reassuring to me. Yeah. So, Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, for spending time with us today. I will see you soon in person, which will be exciting.
Yeah.
And for everyone listening, you will get an email with the recording of today's video, and you will also get the links. All the links that I mentioned are going to be sent out. So thank you all so
Wonderful.
much. Green blessings and lots of love.
Thank you, honey. Thank you so much.
Mwah. Much love.
Bye-bye.
Bye.